I will work day in and day out.
Wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order! Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode of the podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by David Laws, the former Liberal Democrat, Member of Parliament for Yeovil and a Minister in the Coalition, Chair of the Trustees of the Education Policy Institute, and author of a great new book, Serpents, Goats and Turkeys, A Century of Liberal Labour Relations. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you. Very good to be with you.
It's very good to have you on. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, what made you want to write the book in the first place?
Yeah, I think two reasons. I mean, firstly, as somebody that's been involved with politics for a long period of time, I find political history fascinating, but I realised that there was quite a large element of the relationship between Labour and the Liberal Democrats that I didn't know a great deal about, particularly going back before the time I was born, I suppose, into the early relationship between the parties. And also, at the time I wrote the book, we'd got a general election coming up, which I was probably expecting for this autumn rather than July. And I was thinking, that depending upon the results of that election, there might be interesting future issues around the relationship between Labour and the Lib Dems. And it would be useful to try to learn the lessons of history. So I think those were the two reasons for writing the book.
Mm-hmm. And that history is one that, goes back quite a long way, obviously, as you say in the book, to the pact between Herbert Gladstone and Ramsay MacDonald before the 1906 general election. Now, in terms of that pact, what kind of long-term impact do you think that it had on the Liberal Party? And from looking at it from sort of obviously over 100 years hence, do you think that the pact was a good thing, perhaps in the short term, but in the long term had a bit of a negative effect on the Liberal Party?
Yeah, the Pact of 1903, which was between the sort of secret pact between the Liberal leadership and the then leadership of the Labour Party, in particular Ramsay MacDonald, turned out to be really crucial both for Labour's future and for the Liberal future. And the context of the Pact of 1903 was very different from today, in that obviously the political system that we'd had in the run-up to that pact, and we still had in 1903, was one dominated by the then two big political parties, which were the Liberal Party and the Unionist Conservative Party. The Labour Party barely existed. It only really came into being in around 1900. And prior to that, trade unionists and people from the Labour family really had stood as what were known as Lib Lab MPs. So they were from a sort of trade union background, but they stood accepting that they were part of the sort of Liberal family and that they would take the Liberal whip in Parliament. And it was only really in the early 1900s, when the Liberals had been out of power for most of the previous 20 years. They'd really struggled even to field candidates in many seats in the previous general election, that the Liberal chief whip and some of the other Liberal leaders decided to respond positively to an approach from the tiny Labour Representation Committee, as it was known then, about standing down Liberal candidates in a limited number of seats and allowing the Labour Representation Committee, the forerunner of the Labour Party, a free run in those seats. And the 1903 Pact really involved the Liberal Party gaining relatively little, but the Labour Representation Committee getting agreement to stand unopposed in many seats. And indeed, the Labour Representation Committee fielded about 50 candidates in the 700 or so seats in 1906, and 29 of those were elected, and 31 of the 50 LRC candidates had no Liberal opponent by agreement, and most of the Labour Representation Committee MPs who were elected without a Liberal standing. So suddenly, the Labour Representation Committee that barely had enough MPs to count on the fingers of one hand ended up with 29 members of Parliament, and pretty swiftly then formed a relationship with the Lib Lab group in Parliament, who defected and joined a Labour group in 1906 after the general election then. And suddenly there was a significant force of Labour MPs in Parliament. Now, in a way, the Liberals in 1906 didn't mind that too much because it was all part of a landslide victory in which the Unionists were swept out and the Liberals did very well. And the Unionists did strikingly badly on what was actually quite a large share of the vote. So it looked as if this Lib Lab pincer movement against the Conservatives/Unionists had been tremendously successful. But what it did, in the words of one Liberal at the time, was it sort of ushered into life a Serpent, the Labour Party, which was to eventually to sting the Liberal Party to death. So it probably was, in the short term, quite an astute tactical move, but it was to be one of the big contributory factors to the Liberal Party being eclipsed by Labour, which happened very rapidly in the decade or so after the pact was agreed.
Do you think that the pact also shows a change in the internal dynamics of the leadership of the Labour Party? Because, if you look at, for example, Philip Snowden's autobiography, he mentions that Keir Hardie, when he first entered Parliament, was booed by those Lib Lab MPs, that they were the ones who gave him the most stinging words of criticism, as opposed to Conservative MPs. And if we look at Ramsay MacDonald and his subsequent career, there is perhaps a slight more leaning towards the liberal wing of the Labour Party as opposed to Keir Hardie. Do you think that pact shows that shift there really occurring between the kind of Hardie wing of the Labour Party more towards Ramsay MacDonald's wing and eventually him becoming the first Labour Prime Minister?
Yes, you're right. I mean, those divisions within the Labour Party over whether they were a sort of slightly more radical Liberal Party or whether they were a much more radical Socialist Party are evident from these very early days. And I suppose what you've got is pre-1900, some of the emerging Labour Party leaders were very much on the socialist end of the spectrum. Then, as part of the 1903 Pact and the 1906 general election, you see Labour, I think, move more towards a sort of centrist position and not trying to look too radical. And then obviously over the decades after that, Labour gradually shifts to the left, particularly after the split in the Labour Party that left Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowden within the government and caused the Labour Party to divide, and most of the Labour Party to leave then the national government in the 1930s and become far more radical and far more socialist. But in these early days, there was actually quite a lot of policy unity between the Liberal Party and the Labour Representation Committee, the LRC, and they worked quite closely together, particularly in the days between 1906 and the First World War. And of course, the big dividing line economic policy issue of these days between the parties wasn't capitalism versus socialism, as it was later to become. It was actually the division over free trade versus tariffs, which put the Conservative and Unionist Party quite often on the side of tariffs and economic interventionism, and in which, perhaps slightly oddly, given what happened afterwards to the Labour Party and the Liberals were very much united around a conviction on free trade. So while that was the economic dividing line, free trade versus tariffs, the Liberals and the Labour Party were very much on the same side. Once the dividing line came to be between capitalism and socialism, that was a far more divisive factor from the post-First World War period onwards, I guess.
And just going on to that First World War period, that obviously creates quite a division within the Labour Party, particularly, around the Russian Revolution. That obviously has, with some of the more extreme wings of the Labour Party, causes division. And the whole First World War has a very much a lightning rod effect in Labour, doesn't it? One thing that I'd be interested to hear about is that wartime coalition. Obviously, you have a Liberal leader leading it, but you do have some minor Labour MPs as ministers within that government. Could you just explain how that came about and how exactly they worked together in that wartime government?
Yeah, the First World War is very important from a Liberal Labour perspective. Firstly, as you say, because it was the first opportunity for a number of Labour members to become ministers within the coalition government, essentially, which had to be formed in 1915 when the then Liberal government began to find that it was in trouble over various issues relating to the running of the war, and it felt the need to establish a coalition that Labour became a part of. So that was quite a key a moment for Labour, where they actually had people in government for the first time. But as you also say, by the end of the First World War, we had the establishment of the Soviet Union, which suddenly hinted at the possibilities of socialism in one or more countries, but also raised, from a sort of right-wing perspective, this spectre of socialism, which voters in some cases began to be fearful of. But the First World War had also seen, obviously, a massive increase in the size of the state, as very large conflicts tend to do when suddenly government takes control of all sorts of areas of the economy in order to increase war production. And so that was also, I think, quite significant for Labour and for the future of politics, that we suddenly saw the state become much more active, much bigger in size. And that, I suppose, was something that helped Labour. Meanwhile, the First World War turned out to be an absolute disaster for the Liberal Party, who had been containing Labour actually quite well pre the First World War, having let Labour MPs in 1906 through that Gladstone-MacDonald Pact. They'd been contained fairly well until 1914. But during the First World War, the Liberal dream team of Asquith and Lloyd George, Asquith, the fairly impressive but also reassuring presence at the top of the government, who didn't look too radical or frighten off traditional Liberal voters, working together with the much more radical David Lloyd George. That worked well up until 1915, 1916, and then those two fell out in a very big way. And it was the division between the two of them, and Lloyd George in particular stabbing Asquith in the back in 1916, that really ended the Liberal dominance and the duopoly in politics, and created the opportunity for Labour to use the breakthrough of 1906 to establish itself as the second party in British politics, and to shove the Liberals out of the way.
Mm-hmm. And of course, subsequent to that period, you obviously have, during the 1920s, the Liberal Party supporting Labour when it first enters government in 1924 and 1929. Could you explain how those kind of acts, those supports came about, and what impact you think that it had on Labour to have the support of the Liberals in 24 and 29?
Yeah, in 24 and 29, Labour obviously became the government for very short periods of time. They did not have majorities in either of the parliaments, but having ejected the Unionists, the assumption was that they would be able to form a government as the second largest party. And the Liberals felt that they didn't really have much alternative other than to go along with Labour being in office. They felt, particularly in 1924, 23, 24, that Labour were likely to do very badly, and then the Liberals would be ushered back into government, but that didn't happen. And in both periods, Ramsay MacDonald, in particular, as Prime Minister and Labour leader, was trying to convince the public not only that Labour was the new alternative to the Unionist Conservative Party, but that it could be trusted as a relatively moderate and cautious party of government. After all, after one of Philip Snowden's budgets, the economic approach that he was taking was so cautious that even the King wrote to him to congratulate him on the size of his planned budget surplus. So these were days when Labour was being pretty cautious. The Liberals increasingly were realizing that they were not going to get back in power as one of the big parties, and they were beginning to switch horses to changing the voting system to ensure a fairer distribution between votes received and seats achieved. And they got quite close in the period 1929 to 1931 in persuading Labour to change to an alternative vote system. But they ran out of time in 1931 as the government collapsed because of the economic circumstances. And that turned out to be a big missed opportunity for the Liberal Party and possibly for Labour.
And obviously the collapse of the government in 1931, the switching Labour becoming the opposition and MacDonald being propped up by the national government saw Labour at its lowest ebb. But by 1935, you have a recovery in terms of Labour seats. Do you think that 1931 to 1935 period perhaps was a bit of a missed opportunity for the Liberals in terms of could they have capitalised on Labour getting right down to the very lowest it's ever been in 31 and ensured that perhaps the Labour Party wasn't so much of a force in 1935? And why do you think Labour was able to recover between 1931 and 1935 to some extent?
Yeah, I mean, I think in 1931, not only were the Liberals still on a very low number of seats, but just at the moment when the Labour Party had split two ways between the majority deciding that they didn't want to be in the national government and that they would go down a more socialist route, and MacDonald and a minority of others sticking with the national government, the Liberals had actually managed to split three ways. You know, they had one block of Liberal nationals who were close, very close indeed to the Conservatives. They had another bunch of Liberals who were slightly more distant from both parties. And they even had a bunch of Lloyd George Liberals who were distinct from the other two. So splits were continuing to dog the Liberal Party. And this was a divisive, difficult economic decade where increasingly people were being invited to choose between these two alternatives of a right-wing, more capitalist party and a more socialist party that offered much more intervention in the economy, which Labour was freed up to do after the collapse of the government of 29 to 31. So the Liberals were really caught in the middle of this. They didn't have strong leadership. By this time, Asquith had gone, and so had Lloyd George. Their leadership was divided and not very convincing. And therefore, they were not able to capitalise on the opportunities of 1931. And this indeed was the period when the Liberal Party was far more dependent upon Conservative votes to stay in business. Many of the seats that Liberals were fighting were not contested very deliberately by Conservatives. The Liberal Party for the next couple of decades was really on a sort of Conservative-inspired life support machine, where at times, particularly after the Second World War, it might have died out altogether had the Conservative Party insisted on contesting all the seats against the Liberals. And by 1956, you know, we have almost all of the residual tiny number of Liberal MPs only managing to win in situations where they did not face a Conservative candidate opposing them.
And do you think that that's part of the reason that if you look at the 1945 election in comparison to, say, 1906 or 1997 or even 2024, when the Liberals tend to do well, Labour tends to do well, 1945 is a bit of an odd one out in that the Liberals don't do quite as well despite Labour doing really quite well?
Yes, the Liberals by 1945 really, I guess, had disappeared off the map as far as many voters were concerned. They did see the country as facing a basic choice between a Conservative and Unionist party, which had been in power, or at least been in power through the national government for quite a long period of time, and the Labour Party, which was, had strong support from the trade unions and was associated with change and associated with offering a different set of opportunities following the Second World War, more focus on social policy, a better deal for those leaving the armed forces than had happened after the First World War. So the Liberals might have expected to do better in the context of 1945, but they were completely crowded out by Labour. And this was that period where they were trying to offer something different from the other two parties in the centre ground of British politics, but the centre ground was weak, the Liberal leadership was weak, and the political debate was polarised between Conservatives and the new, much more avowedly socialist Labour Party.
And just going forward to the 1970s, the Liberal Party, obviously in the period from 1970 to 1974, going up to that 1970, those two 1974 elections, begins to experience something of a revival. And in 1974, there are perhaps feelings that, Jeremy Thorpe might be able to do better as leader of the Liberal Party than some of his predecessors. What do you think drove that renewal? Was it solely Thorpe? Was it a change in policy? And what kind of effect do you think that it had on Wilson and the Labour Party at the time?
Yeah, I think two things are going on in this period. I mean, firstly, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party had good stints in government after the Second World War, yet the UK still faced a lot of problems, particularly with the economy. So I think many voters in the period from the 60s onwards, right into the 70s, were looking for some other party to punish the traditional two parties that had tended to monopolise Britain's political system for the previous couple of decades. And they were looking for a third party alternative. And therefore, at times, there were surges in the Liberal vote under Joe Grimond's leadership in the late 50s and early 60s, under Thorpe's leadership, and then under David Steel. Ironically, it was also at this time that the Liberal Party started parting company with this with a lot of these informal pacts with the Conservative Party, ended some of the local deals there have been in places like Huddersfield, where there were sort of informal Liberal Conservative pacts, and started at a leadership level to be much more interested in the prospects of getting into power in Westminster and doing deals with other parties, particularly in the post-Grimond, in the Grimond and onwards era with the Labour Party. I think there was much more of a sense amongst the Liberals then that they might have an affinity with Labour in terms of values and some policies. And so Grimond and Steel spend quite a lot of their time seeing whether they can form some sort of arrangement that would get the Liberals into power with Labour and that would give the Liberals a credibility that would then potentially raise their profile and their electoral support. But under both Wilson and Callaghan, they face really Labour leaders and prime ministers who are not that interested in dealing with the Liberals unless they have to. And a Labour Party deeply internally divided, particularly over economic policy issues around nationalisation, but also around Europe. So we find a Liberal Party that's in a way keen to tango and keen to sort of deal with the Labour Party, but a Labour Party that's not that interested and not really a very good fit on policy. So it's an unhappy era where Grimond ends up not being able to do the deals with Wilson that he wanted to, and where David Steel ends up in a Lib-Lab pact that wasn't notably successful from a Liberal perspective.
And on that Lib-Lab pact, that of course is a pact that, as you say, comes from a prime minister who, in James Callaghan, needed the pact rather than necessarily wanting the pact. How do you think that the two parties were able to sustain the pact for the period that they were? I mean, it seems quite extraordinary, really, looking back, to think that they were even able to sustain it for the brief length of time that they were able to.
Yes, well, as you know, the pact was something that Labour desperately needed to stay in power because they'd lost their majority early on in that period when Callaghan was Prime Minister. So the only way that they could see their way through a very difficult period when the government was very unpopular, the economy was doing badly, was to have some arrangement with another party. And even though they might have done deals with the Irish parties for a period of time, the Northern Ireland parties, that probably wouldn't have been a lasting arrangement. So they were lucky, really, that the Liberals and David Steel in particular threw themselves on Labour, desperate for a sort of pact and arrangement. And they asked very little in return for it. A consultative committee was pretty much all they were really demanding. And so this was hugely in Labour's interest. And indeed, the pact got them through a very tough, unpopular period, allowed the economy to stabilise and improve, saw Labour's opinion poll ratings go up very rapidly. The Liberals had completely the opposite experience. Their poll ratings pretty much imploded on the pact being signed. It did very badly in local government elections. But they were arguably doing so badly that they couldn't really pull out of the pact and cause an election. And in any case, by then it had become a fundamental part of David Steel, their leader's belief system, that the Liberal Party had to show that it was serious, that it could be in government, that it could take difficult decisions, and that ultimately it would be repaid for taking those decisions. And his view was that that was the opportunity that the party faced. Another view might be that the Labour Party was increasingly divided in an increasingly fragile position. And actually, it was probably in the Liberals' interests in the late 70s for the Labour Party to collapse and for the Liberals to be part of a more centrist alternative to a Conservative Party that was also moving quite rapidly to the right of the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the Conservative Party moving to the right under Margaret Thatcher, and by the time of 1983, we see the SDP Liberal alliance. In terms of that alliance, do you think that it may have been, as some people have suggested, perhaps more successful if it had been a full merger rather than alliance? And why do you think that at that point a formal merger of the two parties wasn't possible?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely some people in the Social Democratic Party who felt that they didn't have things in common with the Liberals and they wanted to stay separate, most notably David Owen. But I think there were also people like Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams who could see that the Liberal Party by itself might not be a vehicle to secure 40% or 45% of the vote that you need for a government. But actually, a Social Democrat Party might be more attractive to people who had voted Labour previously, who wouldn't have thought of voting Liberal, but who might be won away by the SDP. So I don't think it was the decision to keep the two parts of the alliance separate, Liberal SDP, rather than merge into one party, that did for the attempt to essentially rewrite the rules of British political parties and to create a new party to displace Labour. The two things that really did for the alliance effort were firstly the Falklands War in 1982, which did see a very big, almost overnight resurgence of support for the Conservative Party, rallying behind the government and the flag, particularly once that war was successful. And of course, the first past the post electoral system, because in 1983, the Alliance and the Labour Party polled almost the same share of the national vote, but Labour had almost 10 times as many MPs because first past the post. And that was the crucial moment, therefore, at which the opportunity was missed. By the time we then entered the next parliament, the economic environment was beginning to improve. The Labour Party was beginning to tack back towards the centre, and the opportunity had been missed. So I think those were the two key impediments to the alliance breaking through.
Mm-hmm. And just to move forward to the 1997 election, there was a lot of talk prior to the election of a potential coalition or some kind of agreement between New Labour and the Liberal Democrats. Had that occurred, had Tony Blair not won the landslide that he did, and he had gone into some kind of like arrangement with the Liberal Democrats, what kind of impact do you think that that would have had on the future of British politics, the state of politics now?
I think it could have had a very big impact. I mean, I think that Blair was interested pre-97 and after in two things around the Liberal Democrats. One was keeping them as an insurance policy. You know, he'd seen Labour lose so many elections for so long that he was never prepared to take anything for granted. So the Lib Dems represented for him a sort of perpetual potential insurance policy. But he also couldn't really understand why people like him and some of his senior colleagues were in a different party from people like Paddy Ashdown when they had really quite similar views. So Blair's long-term goal was really to merge the Lib Dems into the Labour Party and to have one party. The impediment to that was firstly that Ashdown's view was more about a pluralist approach to politics, where the Lib Dems and Labour might cooperate but as separate parties. And in addition, the Labour majority in 1997, as you mentioned, was so huge that Labour didn't really need the Liberal Democrats, and Ashdown and Blair didn't manage to agree a referendum on electoral reform, which would have been the key to the two parties working together. But if Labour had not had a majority, or it had a very small majority, then I think you probably would have seen a Lib Lab coalition that would have been quite aligned on many policy areas, and you probably would have seen a referendum of some type on the voting system. And then, you know, everything that went on from then could have been very different in presumably highly unpredictable ways.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. We're coming towards the end of the podcast, David. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. But I do have one final question for you. In terms of the book and people reading the book, what one thing do you hope that anyone who has read the book, will read the book, will take away from reading it?
I think that I hope that they will take away that the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, or the Lib Dems and Labour Party, have been at times very much aligned parties in their outlook on policies and values. But at other times, they've been highly unaligned. You know, in particular, the period from the 1930s onwards, arguably right up to the 1990s, the belief in the Labour Party in socialism, the skepticism about NATO, and in many parts of the Labour Party, the European Union, meant that these were not two natural progressive partners at all, but very distinct and different political parties. But there are other phases of time, particularly arguably now and in the period where Blair and Ashdown were leaders, where the two parties have been far more aligned on values and to some extent on policies. But in those periods, the leaders of the parties have been unable to create mechanisms that would allow the two parties to cooperate in the future, particularly through changing the electoral system. And that inability to look at some of those long-term opportunities has then impeded cooperation and really changed the course of British politics, as we certainly saw in 2010.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me, David, and I hope anyone who is listening will go out and purchase a copy of the book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.